Hello, everyone. Welcome. This event is brought to you by the Student Activism Speaker Series at the Caltech Y. We are delighted to have as our guest today Professor Thomas Hollihan. He is a professor of communication at the USC Annenberg School of Journalism, where he was Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for 10 years. He chairs the Executive Committee of the USC US-China Institute and formerly chaired the Board of Trustees of the National Debate Tournament, the National Communication Association Doctoral Education Committee, the NCA Task Force on Legislative Reform, and the NCA Committee on International Discussion and Debate. He was also president of the American Forensic Association and the Western Forensic Association. He is the author of several books, including Uncivil Wars, Political Campaigns in a Media Age, Arguments and Arguing, The Products and Process of Human Decision-Making, An Argument at Century's End, Reflecting on the Past and Envisioning the Future. We're going to start today with a brief presentation, and then we'll transition into more discussion and Q&A time. So you can raise your hand using the participants window if you want to be called on, and we'll let you ask your question. You can turn your video on or not as you choose. If you prefer not to ask it yourself, you can type it into the chat and I can read it out for you. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Hollihan.
Thank you. Let's see if I can make this happen. And my goal here is to talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then to escape this slideshow and have a real conversation with you. Since on the topic of politics, what I've discovered is that people don't want to be silent. They want to participate, and they prefer to participate in an active way. I've been asked to talk about televised political debates. So just a little bit of background on the research and what we know about debates. The title for this talk that was on the previous slide is a little bit misleading because historically debates have not been uncivil. Even in television debates, historically they have been perhaps the most civilized form of discourse that we've had. And their usefulness to listeners is that debates were the form of political communication that best helped structure political arguments and illustrate difference between the candidates. They also provide moments for voters to take stock of the competing candidates in a race. They help shape the public agenda by driving the issues that all forms of media are going to talk about. And without a doubt, debates are the single most important media moments in a campaign. They usually draw the largest audience, and clips from the debates make their way into other forms of communication as well. With the first Trump debate, for instance, in 2020 against Biden, he drew about a 65 million person audience, which is the largest TV audience outside of the Super Bowl of anything that appears in media. Part of the reason why debates are useful is they really reveal much about candidates, their ability to think on their feet, to move beyond scripts, the habits of mind with regard to how they think about issues or their opponents or their plans, their ability to be emotionally in control, and their style, character, and electoral appeal. Whether you like them or not, if you think back to that recent Trump-Biden debate, you got clear images of the differences in those two men. Not just their intellectual differences, but their stylistic differences, their approach to dealing with people and issues, their level of empathy. So debates really reveal starkly much about candidates. There's also some pretty consistent research, and I just very quickly summarize, that says debates inform viewers. They provide substantial information about issue positions. They help voters summarize issues, and they serve as a catalyst to help people organize their opinions. What we know about politics is that we have become increasingly partisan and polarized, and people who are very partisan have by and large already made up their minds on how they're going to vote. Partisans vote in almost every election. The people who decide campaigns, however, and who ultimately decide elections are people who tend not to be very partisan. And these are people who don't pay much attention to political news. And so tuning into the debate is going to help them decide between these two candidates. I don't know about you, but when I watched the focus group after the first Trump-Biden debate and they're interviewing undecided voters, my first reaction is, who could remain undecided given the stark, clear differences between these two candidates? But there are people like that who just don't pay attention to politics until the last minute. And so for them, the debate is when they may begin to attend to a campaign. We first had presidential debates in 1960 when there were 4 60-minute long television debates. And it is estimated that 80% of the American electorate saw or heard at least one of those debates, and that 55% saw or heard all 4 of those debates, which is an extraordinarily high number of people attending to political campaigns. After 1960, though, we didn't have debates for several years. And I put this slide in because it really tells you something about the process of debate. Debates are all about strategy, and candidates will decide to debate and decide how many debates they'll participate in based upon whether or not they think the debate participation will help them.
We can't see your slides, by the way.
I'm sorry?
We can't see your slides.
You can't see my slides. What happened? Have you not seen them at all?
Nope.
Well, that's crazy. Thanks for letting me know. They come up on my screen. Can you get it now?
No. Did you share your screen?
Yes, I did. Huh.
There we go. We can see them now.
Now you can see it? Oh my
Yes.
goodness. Well, thank you for telling me. You didn't miss much, really. They're not very exciting. The point I was making is that LBJ is so far ahead of Goldwater that he didn't want to debate. And in 1968, Nixon didn't want to debate again because he remembered that the turning point in the 1960 race was his poor performance in the debates against Kennedy. And so we didn't get debates again until 1976, when Gerald Ford, who was an incumbent, but an incumbent who had never faced election, had never stood before the voters as a presidential candidate, decided he was trailing in the polls and he needed to make himself available to debate Jimmy Carter. And Carter, who was a challenger, thought, of course I want to debate because it puts me on equal standing with the President of the United States. So in 1976, we began to hold presidential debates again. And literally every year since, we've held them. And now I think there's an assumption that debates have to occur. There were some conversations that said maybe Biden shouldn't even bother to debate Trump this year because many people, including his close advisors, expected the kind of debate performance that Trump actually gave us. And they said there's nothing to be gained for Biden by participating. But there's now kind of a strong presumption that debates will occur and people expect them. In 1992, when Clinton debated George H.W. Bush, we had the first introduction of what became known as the town hall format. The town hall format is candidates taking questions from audiences, typically of undecided voters. And this changed the nature of debates quite dramatically because it permitted candidates to talk directly to voters. If you Google some YouTube images from the 1992 town hall debate, you're going to see the tremendous skill difference that was on display when George H.W. Bush or Ross Perot talked directly to voters versus Bill Clinton. And I put that in because one of the things that really reveals is the degree to which debate performances are about connecting to voters. And that means non-verbally connecting. That means communicating directly to get people the sense that you share their feelings and values and beliefs. And there's a wonderful excerpt from this debate where Clinton's mastery as a communicator really shines through. And many people who've done research on the 92 presidential election say that this is the turning point in that campaign, that it's after the town hall debate that George H.W. Bush begins to lose traction and Clinton emerges and ultimately, of course, defeats him, and Bush does not get a second term. In 1996, I'm sorry, that's a typo on this slide. In 1996, I mentioned this because this was the lowest number of viewers ever to see a presidential debate. We dropped from over 80% in 1960 to 43% in 1996 when Clinton and Bob Dole debated. Now, there are several things that are happening in this race that may account for this. One is we've had the invention of cable television. And so we had way more media alternatives in 1996 than we did in 1960. In 1960, in my hometown of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I grew up, there were 3 TV stations, and all of them carried the presidential debates. And so there was no avoiding them. By the time you get to 1996, we've got satellite TV and cable TV, and there's lots of channels. And so audience segmentation is already occurring. The other thing that happened, though, is we began to see that voters were saying they weren't very interested in this race because Dole was already so far behind Clinton that voters had made their mind. And so fewer people watched this debate than ever before. And it was not a particularly memorable series of debates. When Obama debates McCain in 2008, there's an interesting moment. And I actually, I don't have an image of it showing here, but they did the town hall debates, and they had Obama and McCain each on tall stools, and they would get off the stools to go approach the questioner and answer the question when asked directly. And the stark thing that's revealed is how young and physical and lithe Obama is versus how kind of slow and crippled, and he's a war hero who was badly injured while he was detained in Vietnam, McCain was. And so it got to the point as the debate proceeded that McCain stopped trying to get up on his stool. He was too conscious of the fact that his physicality was one of the things that was really affecting his perception in the eyes of voters as much as his perception on issues. So it's not just, do voters listen to arguments? Voters are trying to connect to make some judgment about the health, the vitality, the personality style, as I've already said about the debaters. So what do we know about TV debates? Well, first of all, they're not real debates. If you go to watch a debate tournament at a high school or a university, you'll see debaters engaged in extensive policy or value debate arguments. They're nothing like what presidential debates are. In many senses, a presidential debate on television is more like a glorified joint press conference where a reporter is firing off questions to both candidates. I have done some coaching for debate candidates for political campaigns, and your advice is almost the same. Listen to the question, acknowledge the question, answer it as quickly as you can, and then pivot to what you want to talk about. And so if you watch the presidential debates, you'll literally see that technology employed. They listen, they answer very briefly, and then they turn to what they want to talk about. And that can be frustrating if you're a traditionally trained debate person, but if you're an ordinary audience, the research says they don't pay that much attention. They're just not that engaged with the actual text they're hearing. Most debates now don't have much candidate face-to-face interaction. The Trump-Biden debate was absolutely exceptional because there was so much candidate face-to-face interaction and so much incivility. I have never seen a debate marked by such a high degree of incivility, and we'll talk more about that later. Other things we know about debates, though, is candidates don't use much evidence. And in a series of studies, my colleague Patricia Riley and I studied whether or not candidates used evidence or analysis or critical reasoning, and whether or not audiences could detect which candidate was using evidence or analysis and critical reasoning. And the fact of the matter is, they don't use much evidence, they don't use much analysis, and audiences don't care and don't notice if they do or not. In fact, what we know is most Republican partisans think their Republican candidate did the better job of debating in most debates. And most Democratic partisans think the Democratic candidate did the better job of debating in most candidate debates. And most of those who are less partisan, independent but maybe lean left or lean right, are likely to think that the direction of the candidate they lean toward did the better job of debating. So that leaves very few people that are actually deciding who won the debate based upon what they hear in the debate. It's not to say there are none, And for the factors I've already told you about, it's not to say that debates don't have some consequence to people, just not very much. The most important thing for a candidate to avoid is a major gaffe, a major mistake. Because what the mistake becomes is the soundbite that's going to replay over and over again in the media after the coverage of the debate is finished, but the lingering residue of the debate persists. And so, you know, in past debates, there are several examples of what got taken for a gaffe. Gerald Ford, for instance, seemed to say that the nations behind the Iron Curtain weren't really under the control of the Soviets, and that became the dominant issue that was talked about. In another contest, Michael Dukakis was asked, you know, we know you've opposed capital punishment, but how would you feel if your wife, Kitty Dukakis, was raped and murdered? And he said, well, you know, I've always opposed capital punishment and I still would oppose it. He showed no human emotion, and that became the gaffe that people talked about. I think the last debate with President Trump contained so many mistakes of strategy and calculation that literally that was all people were talking about for days. So avoiding the gaffe is the key issue. I also want you to know when primaries may be the time when debate performance matters most. And it matters most because we don't know very much about a lot of the candidates who are seeking to emerge as the nominee in a primary race. I mean, look how crowded this field is. But it also becomes almost impossible to make a debate as a format for communication, an effective communication device to introduce the candidates. So this year, they split the debate in the Democratic primary, and they would do half of them in one evening and half of them the following evening. But then you get these different dynamics by who's on the stage with whom, and whether or not you got a break if you were on the stage with the front runners, or if you were on the stage at, you know, it was the equivalent of the children's table at Easter dinner. So I think that becomes one of the consequences of dealing with debates in a small field. Viewers don't seem to hold candidates responsible to respond to the arguments of their opponents. So most coaches who are working with candidates for debates say, just get on your message. As much as possible, have message discipline and talk about your core message. Viewers can, however, recognize who's defensive. And so if the candidate makes an attack on you and you get all defensive and upset about the attack, viewers are really sensitive to that. And that's a problem that incumbents often have. So even Obama, who was a very effective debater, did not do as well in the first debates of 2012 as he had done in 2008 because he had a record to defend. And of course, Trump had a record to defend, which may have been why he was so aggressively on the attack against Biden. I've already mentioned viewers don't recognize evidence. It is helpful, however, for a candidate to be perceived as critical of your opponent, but you can overdo that, obviously. And as I said, being perceived as defensive doesn't help you a bit. Debates are used to help determine whether or not a candidate is credible. And this is important all through a race, but especially important in a primary race. If a voter suddenly decides that you can't really come off as somebody credentialed for the office, campaigns are going to sputter very quickly to an end, and you're going to fade from sight. And as I've already mentioned, they have the greatest impact when people don't know much about a candidate. So going into the debate, Trump and Biden, we know Trump and his style pretty well. And for a lot of people, they saw what they expected to see, although maybe even amped up a little bit from what they were accustomed to seeing. And in Biden, they saw what they expected to see. So I think that, you know, that's one of the challenges. And debates are a rich source of information, and they don't ask much of voters. If I'm going to watch a debate, I can be really passive. It's not like I have to pick up and read something, and I'm going to get a pretty data-rich exposure to these candidates. In responding to debates, people are often going to say things like, who projects the most confidence, who projects poise, honesty, trustworthiness. I mean, these are natural sort of things that voters are seeking to make judgments of. Voters appreciate the use of humor and wit. So often the candidate who can say something humorous, that's going to be what's most memorable for the debate. And the last point I'm going to make is debates must be part of a candidate's strategy. So what you approach a debate with in terms of how you think about the issues you're going to raise and the arguments you're going to make has to be linked to your core strategy to try to gain election. And so if you start as a candidate, what most campaigns do is they first take a poll to see who the likely voters who might support them are and where the fault lines are. What issues are going to define how voters are likely to fall in a particular district? What issues matter most to people? And then they have to figure out which of those possible voters are accessible to them. And in a race like this one, we're down to the point now where fewer than 10% of voters, likely voters in the United States, are undecided. Most people are locked in, and they've been locked in for a long time. So you have to approach it strategically. If you're the president's consultant, you have to say, who do we need to try to win to reverse this downturn we're facing in the polls, particularly with an eye towards swing states? And I can tell you that this election is going to largely be decided in the suburbs by white women. Trump barely won white women in 2016, and he's badly trailing with white women in 2020. Trump has shored up pretty good support among men, although he's losing older men and older women that he got in 2016 because they're people really at risk for COVID. So he doesn't want to talk about COVID very much. That's the issue he's most upside down in this polling. And he wants to try to win back white suburban women. What's the one thing white suburban women most frequently say they don't like about President Trump? His style, his tweets, his incivility, and his abusive behavior toward other people. When polled, white women say, I like a lot of his policies, but I don't like these dimensions of his leadership style. So when he came out swinging at Biden the way he did in that first debate, he gave exactly the wrong message for the stakeholder group that he most needed to try to reach. And that's a real problem now, because having lost that first debate pretty handily, 20-point gap in some of the polls that I've seen, and having then gotten COVID and not be able to debate in the second debate, I don't know if there's any way he can recover, especially given that in many of the states, people are already voting early. So that's really what I have for you. I would be happy to take some questions to chat with you about debates in general, the debates we've seen, expectations for whether or not we'll see further debates, or how this campaign is likely to unfold in the days to follow.
So for anyone who missed the beginning, you can either raise your hand in the participants window and be called on, or you can write your question in the chat and I will read it out.
I can share the slides too, the early slides you were unable to see. I will email them to you, Kathleen, so you can pass them on to anyone who wants to request them.
Okay, that would be great. I will go ahead and start out with a question, actually. And watching these debates, I've been hearing a lot of things about there needs to be some power of the moderator to cut people off or to press for an answer. What sort of structural things like that do you think could best be chosen to improve debates?
Yeah, the debate was really painful with Trump interrupting, absolutely. So being able to turn off the microphone would have been a gift. And, you know, Mike Pence went overtime. I mean, he just disregarded the time. Now the timekeeper sought to adjust the time. And so she would extend Biden's time if Trump had gone, or Pence rather, had gone overtime. So in the end, they both spoke almost equal amounts of time, but it didn't come across that way if you just watch the debate. One of the reasons Trump clearly didn't want the virtual debate that the Presidential Commission on Debates proposed is that he was fearful that they would just silence him and mute his microphone. And then he would be up there, you know, kind of gasping like a fish looking for air. gesturing and his mouth kind of manipulation, it's hard to say what you can do. And the problem is if they're in a literally physical space of sharing the same room, even if you mute the microphone, then one person talking over the other is still disruptive. And I had several colleagues who were pretty hard on Joe Biden. And I said, you know, I would be more forgiving, because if somebody is literally interrupting and screaming at you, and you're up there on a stage and you're trying to think without notes, it's very difficult. And so, you know, given the intervention, I thought he actually did a pretty good job. I don't know that there's anything you can do other than a strong moderator. And I thought with Chris Wallace, he really did attempt to rein in that debate. I thought the moderator in the vice presidential debate just didn't try very hard, and maybe didn't confront the speakers. But I think voters have to communicate to candidates that they really don't like that style. And I know that even a lot of Republican senators, for instance, were angry, hadn't tempered his remarks enough. Because if you're a down ticket candidate, and the candidate at the top of your ticket does a performance that's so fraught with negative reactions, I think that works against you. And so I think that's the only place you likely put really active pressure is that the moderator steps in, and then other people in the party really say, you know, this backfired, and backfired badly.
Okay, we have a couple questions in chat. Do you know why they wouldn't mute the microphone in that debate? Is that some sort of a contract with the organizers?
I suspect they didn't have an agreement that they would be able to mute the microphone. And so the only person who likely could have muted it is the director in the booth, and not the moderator. I don't think the moderator had control over the microphones. So I think the director of the TV production conceivably could have muted it. But absent an understanding, and all those rules are negotiated by the campaigns, of course. The Commission on Presidential Debate doesn't set the conditions. They work with the campaigns, and each campaign is actively trying to set conditions that are uniquely favorable to their candidate. So I suspect that's why they couldn't mute in real time in that debate. I think many of us preferred a format where they could mute, however.
Another question in the chat. American politics is increasingly tribalistic and reminds me of democracies based on ethnic lines, where votes are almost entirely based on ethnicity. Do you know about debates in those democracies and whether they serve any point at all?
Well, you know, our debates historically, I think, have been useful. It's really a recent phenomena that politics has become as polarized and as tribal as it is now. And there are lots of reasons for it, but it's the media ecology more than anything else. It's the emergence of cable news networks, and then, of course, social media, digital media, where people are accessing information primarily through Facebook and sources like that, and they're reading the posts of friends who share their political opinions for the most part. And so we've got a really toxic media ecology, and it's produced all kinds of consequences. If you go to the healthiest democracies, for example, those in Western Europe, debates don't look anything like the debates here, and they're civilized affairs, and there's a good deal of humor, and they're highly productive. Even in places like Japan, debates are very orderly. I mean, there's almost a sense in which my Japanese friends say they're boring because they're so technical, and you know, they're not very exciting as TV drama. What we have now is a reality TV star who is essentially trying to reproduce a reality TV format for all of his communication engagements with the public, including his return from Walter Reed Hospital, which, you know, looked, as many said, like the scene from Evita, right? So, you know, we've got a very different media ecology. I think in most places where the government is already fiercely authoritarian, they've done away with the guise of debating. I mean, why debate? You know, it just gives legitimacy to a political opponent when there isn't a need to do so. And that's, you know, the real result, I think, of a move toward authoritarian government is fewer opportunities for real conversation.
There's a question Eduardo wants to ask of our video.
Oh, but I think Ellen had a question before that.
Yes, okay. So do you know why viewers don't seem to pay attention to whether candidates are saying evidence-based statements? Has there been any discussion of implementing live fact-checking, and if not, why?
There a lot of networks, for instance, do a fact check tracker. And a lot of people now, particularly young people we know, are watching a political debate on multiple screens, and one screen is devoted to Twitter or to some other social media sharing, which is offering fact checking in real time. Even more importantly than that, though, I think the answer to the question, Eduardo, is that people don't listen to facts as much as they listen for stories. People are narrative reasoners, and we reason by listening to stories. And in stories, if a story generally coheres internally and externally, if it seems similar to other stories we've heard, there's such a strong confirmation bias for partisans. They don't want to have to challenge a belief they already hold dear. So they're looking for minimally sufficient arguments to convince themselves of truths they already believe. Does that make sense? And so facts are not really so much a part of that. It's also why conspiracy narratives are so popular, because we're used to social media sharing conspiracies, and we're used to watching on television conspiracies unfold. And so conspiracy becomes a form of storytelling that we're very familiar with, and we get into the habit of just looking for the likely conspirators and not challenging the beliefs. So the research says you respond with misstatements better with counter narratives than counter facts, but it's very difficult to get people to think that way. Especially scientists, by the way, and technical people. I do a lot of consulting with, well, I used to do it with the national labs, now do it with the UN organization, but talking to scientists who think, well, look, I'm gonna just put my data slides up and everybody will see my point. And well, your data tells a story only if you supply the story. Otherwise, people will just start supplying their own story to your data. And so, you know, it's how people are conditioned to reason, I think.
What UN organization do you work with?
I was doing work with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and the Safeguards Group, which is the group that makes sure we get compliance with nuclear protocols.
Eduardo, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Okay. So you did mention that the current polarization in the US is unprecedented, and that if you compare with Western European democracies, they're far, far more civil. Now, one of the things that I think is the primary enabler of this rapid polarization is the fact that you only have two parties in the US. For example, I'm from Brazil, and in Brazil, even though it's a presidentialist system, there's over 30 parties. And so when voters got extremely disillusioned with the Workers' Party 5 or 6 years ago, they didn't have to go all the way to the most right-wing possible party. They could just switch to, you know, the Social Democratic Party, of which there are like 5 with Social Democratic in name. And so that really helps keep things centered. The same thing I think happens in most of Europe because they're parliaments, and so they have this coalitions.
Right.
And so when you get really mad at this party, you just shift a little bit. You don't have to go all the way over here. Do you see a way of disarming that situation in the US, given that there are no intermediary parties?
I don't see it happening that we'll get strong third parties or fourth parties until we find a strategy to do away with the Electoral College. because when it's a winner-take-all system in the state, and then you load it up with an electoral college that, of course, strongly favors rural and small states because of how electors are assigned in the Constitution, it really discourages the formation of third parties. The last time we had third-party candidates who actually won electoral votes was George Wallace in 1968, who interestingly ran a campaign that in some ways resembled Trump's. Very conservative, nativist, populist, anti-integration, anti-civil rights sort of platform that appealed to the states of the former Confederacy. And he won electoral votes. That's the last time a third party won an electoral vote in the United States. And voters are loath to throw a vote away. So that's why we don't get many people voting for third party candidates. I absolutely think you're right that third party, fourth party might empower more people to be politically engaged, because they may say, I'm not this extreme left or this extreme right the way these parties have become. And, you know, one consequence of Trump, I mean, this scenario we're in could play out in a lot of different ways, but one possible endpoint for Trump is that ultimately he's going to lead eventually to the demise of the Republican Party, and something new will emerge on its ashes. And I say that because of the demographic gaps in the party, which are so wide. And I say that also because the Republicans are going to push through this Supreme Court appointment, which is going to create a court that will be able to block a lot of progressive political voting that a lot of people are going to be very frustrated by, particularly young people. If they start rolling back environmental controls, if they start rolling back things like gay marriage or women's right to choose, they take healthcare away from people who now have actively got it, we could see a kind of political realignment that is dramatic. Because as the country becomes less democratic and the court can block every activity, there could be a real political pressure, unlike anything we've seen. And of course, we've had periodic political realignments in the United States. Post-civil rights bill, that's when the South became Republican, right? As Southern Democrats fled to the Republican Party, and the North became the party of minorities, and the Democrats became the party of the North of minorities and of a much more diverse progressive electorate. And so we could see some dramatic changes, but I don't think we'll see a multi-party state emerge here. I think it's unlikely.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions in the chat. The primary factors where President Trump gained support from men, and did his aggressive attitude in the debate have a positive impact in gaining support from male voters?
There's evidence that Trump has held on to the same voters that are his most loyal base. You know, throughout his presidency, he's been the most remarkably consistent in terms of polling numbers of my memory. He's polled around the low 40s, 40 to 43%. So the people who committed to Trump, by and large, are sticking with him. And in fact, I would say they wrap their own identity around their support for him as part of a badge of who they are, right? I'm a Trump voter, in part maybe because so many people said, why are you doing that? And they were forced to account for their votes. So now they really see themselves as linked to him. But I have seen virtually no evidence that in 4 years he's been able to expand his base of support. And so I don't think he's won new voters so much as he's held on to most of the male voters he had in 2016. And the gender gap in politics is huge. It's been huge for some time. I mean, it existed back in 2008, but it's actually grown. And the fact that we have a woman on the Democratic ticket, the fact that, you know, I think Pence's mistake in talking over Senator Harris as much as he did in that debate was that he was confirming the feelings a lot of women have, that he was mansplaining to her, and that, you know, women don't get listened to in the same way, that men interrupt women. We know from the communication research 3 or 4 times more often than women interrupt men. My wife reminds me of that, by the way. So I don't think either of these campaigns are actually actively expanding the base of support all that much. Biden is, however, bringing home again some of those disaffected voters who really had trouble with Hillary Clinton, who were maybe affected by the Comey letter coming in at the last moment in 2016, or who may not have been enthusiastic and may have stayed home. You know, the Russian hacking had a huge role to play in 2016. Kathleen Hall Jameson, who's the former dean of the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, has a very fine book that says the hacks and the release of those emails on WikiLeaks were perfectly timed in the campaign. So we get the Access Hollywood tape, which is Trump in his own words talking about how when you're a celebrity, you can do anything. And then you get a data dump to kind of distract people. So absent those kinds of interventions at the last minute, I think this race is actually all but over. Now, will Trump concede defeat? Will we have a huge series of legal challenges if the race is close? Because Democrats are going to vote primarily, you know, in many states by absentee. And in some of these swing states, they can't even begin counting the absentee votes until Election Day. That's where the potential problems, I think, still lie. But usually we don't see a dramatic change in the polls. The 2016 polls weren't as far off as you might think they were. It was just an abnormality of the Electoral College system in very close races in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania.
Okay, another question here. What is the difference between a counter-narrative and a counter-fact? And can you give an example?
Yeah, a counter-fact would just be, you know, you say that climate change, the average temperature is going up to 120 degrees in, you know, Death Valley. And I say, well, really, these are aberrations that occur. And so the norm is not as high. And then I supply contrary data. So that's a counterfact, right? A counter narrative would be an actual countering story that engages people and draws them in. So, for example, if I wanted to provide a counter narrative about Russian intervention in the election, I would get people to think about what they know about Soviet information systems and why would Russia want to intervene in the US election? What would Russia have to gain by convincing us that this is true? Why would Russia, based on what we know about Russia's past character or behavior, want to sow discord in the American election? What's in it for Russia, for instance, if we elect a president who doesn't support NATO? Well, gee, maybe that, you know, diminishes the Western possible intervention threat if they move into the Ukraine or move into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia very quickly. So you engage what people already believe and tell a counter story.
Okay, in general, do you believe the Electoral College should be removed? And what are the benefits and pitfalls of doing that?
Well, I definitely think it should be done away with. I think it's an artifact of really history and frankly of a time of slavery. It was designed in the 18th century by slave owners who were trying to protect their political interests. And what they couldn't have imagined, that, you know, our founding fathers were very thoughtful, but what they couldn't have imagined was the urban-rural split that America became, because they couldn't have imagined so many people being free from food production, right? They couldn't have imagined mechanized agriculture. So they could never have imagined huge, gigantic cities and population distributed the way it is now. When we're in a situation where we've got, you know, 40 million people in California, and they get 2 US senators, and we've got 40 million people in a whole bunch of smaller rural states, and they get 46 US senators, and yet the Senate can block every bill that comes out of the House. That's not democratic. And ultimately, as I mentioned with the court, ultimately, if the nation becomes fundamentally undemocratic and doesn't respond to the interests of the people, I mean, that can lead even to political violence. I mean, it could become a very, very serious situation if we begin to get government that doesn't respond to the needs of people, particularly if the people who are not responded to are disproportionately people of color, or people who are younger, or women, people who have, you know, unique sets of political interests that aren't being served by minority politics that manages to maintain control of government. That's a dangerous situation. And it will ultimately mean that the US will lose respect around the world. You know, the post-World War II product was the creation of American hegemonic authority. And it wasn't just military authority, it was a framework of laws and of democracy as something meaningful. But to the degree we become more visibly less democratic, then we'll weaken our moral authority to be able to act forcefully in the world. And that's not a happy picture either.
Okay, another question about the Electoral College. I've heard that removing the Electoral College will not have a large effect on the results of the elections. That in the cases where candidates lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College, those candidates would have just won the popular vote without the Electoral College because they would have campaigned differently and focused on turnout. So even if the Electoral College is abolished, the elections would turn out the same. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think the chance of our doing away with the Electoral College is slim and none. I mean, to pass a constitutional amendment requires not just the bill through the House and Senate, but it requires confirmation by 2/3 of the states. And small rural states are not going to easily trade away their political authority and power. So I think really the prospect of doing away with it is very, very poor. There are some other kinds of strategies that have been discussed, of things like to have individual slates of electors vote that they will support the popular vote winner, regardless of who carries their state. And I think that kind of reform is more likely. Then the comment, would it change elections? I mean, that remains to be seen. It kind of depends, I think, on the candidate. So if I'm a candidate of the Democratic Party and I know that my supporters are disproportionately made up of people of color vis-a-vis my opponent, I'm going to spend my time campaigning where I find my voters, more than likely. And so I think the argument that political scientists often make about the Electoral College is that it would skew how campaigns were conducted, and that some candidates would direct all their activity to rural and predominantly white areas, and others would direct most of their campaign activity to urban and suburban areas. So, you know, does it change the outcomes? It kind of depends, I think, on the nature of the candidates that are coming forth and the issues that they most want to talk about. And of course, you know, the issue agenda changes in response to the facts on the ground at any given point in time. So it sort of depends on the state of the economy, for instance. There are a lot of political scientists who've done research that says campaigns don't matter, that most voters simply vote the interests of their own pocketbook in deciding who they're going to vote for. So if they evaluate whether or not they're doing well, they're going to vote one way. If they're doing poorly personally, they're going to vote another way. Now, I think that support for that kind of research is diminishing now because the media ecology plays such a different role and polarization has become so much greater. But it's hard to predict how, you know, doing away with the Electoral College would change, because I even think that we would see different kinds of candidates if you had to run to achieve a different kind of political objective. The emergence of technologies of election also, you know, change what kind of candidates emerge successfully. These things are all kind of knitted together. Politics is Darwinian in the sense that it's always evolving and it's very high stakes. So it matters in America who wins elections, which is why so much money pours into the coffers to try to win special favors and to shape favorable legislation, et cetera. So I think if we ever really did find a way to do away with the Electoral College, we would see all kinds of other Darwinian evolutionary moves as candidates tried to respond to the new determinants of who would help them get elected.
If you remove the Electoral College and the Senate, doesn't that go against the principle of federalism and move toward a unitary state?
Yeah, well, again, I don't think it's going to happen. So there are people who say the only way we'll ever really address a lot of the problems of the US Constitution, like for instance, the Second Amendment, you know, it's hard to imagine that the founders who were thinking about the right to bear arms were thinking about assault weapons and Uzis and, you know, maybe flamethrowers, right? So there are people who say what we should have is a constitutional convention where you assemble the states. There's a provision for this in the Constitution, and you put the entire document at risk of being amended and evolved. But of course, there's a huge uncertainty with that, right? Who knows how it would turn out? And there's a lot of anxiety and fear that you would throw so many things open all at one time. Other countries have managed to do it, sometimes with the guidance of the United States, by the way. You know, we've helped other democracies write new constitutions, and some of them have produced wonderful documents, but things as they are favor some interest groups. And so there'd be tremendous resistance to doing so, and tremendous anxiety about all that would be at risk if we were to make such changes.
Okay, I believe Greg has a question he's going to ask over video.
Thank you again, Professor, for being with us. Great talk. I'm just wondering, what's the wildest idea, craziest idea you've come across for how to change up the debates?
To change the debates? The most common ideas I hear are take the moderator out of the role and challenge candidates to have to directly respond to each other and to give them more rather than less speaking time. So the model would be each candidate has to give a 5-minute speech, and then the other candidate has to respond, and to try to encourage candidates to actually learn how to refute each other's arguments the way real debaters do. And you would, of course, approach that kind of debating very differently. If you go back and look at the texts of the Lincoln Douglas debates, those candidates spoke sometimes for 45 minutes to an hour and then responded to each other, which is like, can you imagine the attention span of people today watching that unfold? But of course, they didn't have entertainment then, right? So it was a totally different sort of environment. And they were outside gathering around the candidates with no amplification capability. So, you know, the contests were fundamentally different. But most of the things that I see that I think would have some chance to work have more candidate interaction, more actual speaking time with the focus on challenging them to refute each other's ideas. You know, it was crazy in the vice presidential debate, for instance, for her to think she had to introduce 9 separate questions in 90 minutes. I mean, that was goofiness, right? When what we really wanted on some of those was a follow-up, but she's always breaking it off to go to another. So more extended interactions, I think, is really the best thing to try to aim for. The town hall debates are very popular with voters. I actually don't think they're as good typically as the debates where you've got a trained reporter asking questions, because you get a lot of goofy kind of softball questions and you get a lot of confusing questions. But you know, anything that creates more interest from the public may be a good idea. We had the internet debates a few years ago where people were asking questions via social media. And so the climate change question was asked by Melting Snowman, for instance. And, you know, even in one sense, it's kind of odd and humorous. On another, it may produce a form of engagement with voters that may be helpful to try to get particularly younger people more engaged. Younger voters are the biggest challenge. You know, in terms of percentage of turnout, 18 to 24-year-old voters vote in the lowest number. And especially Latino voters, 18 to 24. They don't vote very often. So, you know, a lot of what you have to be doing is thinking of strategies of engagement for voters you'd really like to see become active. We know voting is habit forming, right? So if I can get you to vote the first time you're eligible, you're more likely to be a lifelong voter.
Great. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we are close to our time now, so thank you very much for this talk. It's been really interesting. If anyone has one final question, we have time for that. Otherwise, we will stop here.
If you could add one constitutional amendment, what would it be?
Well, I think I would add an amendment that moved us toward dealing with this lack of fairness with regard to the value of a vote. You know, a vote in California counts a fraction of what a vote from a citizen of Wyoming counts. And that affects not just the Electoral College, but that affects every piece of legislation coming through Washington. And I think that's really important. I mean, probably would change our country more than anything else if we really had a popular will electorate. The other thing is closely related. We need to do something about what's happening in the cable news space. I mean, I'm a huge supporter of the First Amendment, and I get it, especially with regard to political speech. But the degree to which we have now conflated highly polarized entertainment with news has created a real challenge. And people simply do not have the new media literacy to be sufficiently informed. And when we're in a situation where 60+% of Republican voters say they get most of their news from Fox, that's a huge challenge. I mean, try to spend an evening watching this kind of programming, and you'll see why you get so many conspiracy narratives floating around. And there's a lot of data that says Republicans were way more likely to be sharing conspiracy narratives and fake news in 2016 than were Democrats. And it's because of the total media ecology that they're deeply engaged in, I think. And that's a huge problem. And we need a conservative party in this country, by the way. I am not an opponent of conservative politics. We strongly need a conservative party. Countries that move toward one-party democratic states pretty quickly become non-democratic states. So we need a viable conservative party, but it's a real challenge what's happened. Great interview, by the way, with Murdoch's son, James, in yesterday's New York Times Magazine that you should take a read. I think it's in the style section, but very provocative article.
All right, we are at 1 o'clock, so we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Hollihan. This has been wonderful.
Sorry about the slides not showing at first, but I will send them to you, Kathleen, and anybody who wants to request them can send a note to Kathleen.
That will be great.
All right, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.